When you run a channel reviewing the kind of movies that I do, be it B-movies, well-respected horror movies, sci-fi horror, horror in a conventional sense, slasher movies, potentially supernatural ones, there are certain movies which you pretty much have to feature. Stuff like Alien, Predator, The Thing, and a variety of others which we have already discussed. This one, I would say, is one of those. It's not necessarily held in the same kind of regard by most movie critics, but by those who are, such as myself, and probably those of you who follow this channel, fans of monster movies, B-movies, creature features. This is a staple of the genre. And in fact, this is one of the oldest movies of this type which will ever be on the channel, apart from stuff like Nosferatu, which of course is even older, which I do hope to get to eventually. Now this movie is of course The Blob, one of the most iconic B-movies ever, pretty much the definition of a B-movie monster, and it's a monster which is actually very easy to underestimate in terms of just how terrifying it would be to be killed by this creature. But we'll touch on that in just a second. Now this is the original version, and over the following 3 weeks I plan to release a review for both of the Blob movies, both this original and also the 1988 movie, and in this particular video, this first one, I would recommend sticking around for the whole thing because I'm also going to do a mini review for Son of the Blob, also known as Beware the Blob, from the 70s. That's the sequel, of course, because that movie doesn't deserve its own video, so that kind of gives you an idea of what my review is going to be like for that one. But first of all, let's talk about the 50s one. Steve McQueen starring, classic effects which are still iconic, certain moments which are still iconic and have been parodied in other movies. It's, I would say, a great B-movie, because what this movie does really well, and really it's something which a ton of modern horror films could take a page out of the book of The Blob on, is that it focuses more on the characters involved than the creature. Now, we're getting to the point where saying that a horror movie should focus on the characters is almost becoming its own cliche, but the only reason why saying that is becoming a cliche is because people don't listen. They keep making these horror films which have all of the budget spent on those crazy final effects in the last 2 minutes of the film, where you see the monster's final form, or it comes out of the shadows, or you see the final girl kill the creature, or the monster, or the killer, and that's it. The rest of the time they're cookie-cutter characters who trip on flat surfaces, make stupid decisions, all that kind of usual tropey stuff. And I know that a lot of people in the genre enjoy those tropes. It's kind of what you expect going into a horror film. But as I've mentioned and alluded to before on the channel, I am not a fan of horror films. I'm a fan of good horror films, and there aren't all that many. If we're really honest about it, you can actually count the absolute best horror films basically in a tidy little list. It could be up to, say, 100 movies, but you'd be pushing it to get that far. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the ones that really are good are superb, and that's why those ones will often transition to being not just great horror films, but great films, period, and that movie reviewers will give them that kind of acclaim, such as the ones which we mentioned earlier, The Thing, Alien, a variety of others. Now this movie doesn't necessarily get that level of acclaim, certainly not these days, but for its time, this is a movie which I would say is as respectable as many of the much newer horror films that we've discussed, even some of the best ones, because the effects in The Blob are excellent for the 50s, the characters are easily better than 90% of modern horror films, because A, you actually care about them, B, they are not stereotypical, at least for the most part, and C, you get enough time spent around the characters both before and during the events of The Blob, the horrific moments that is, to actually feel like they're real characters. They're not just people who are bang, introduced to, bang, they're in a situation, bang, now they're running for their life, bang, now some of them are dead, and now some of them are alive. That's such an easy way to structure the story. And I'm not saying that this film doesn't do some of those things, of course it does. That's how you tell a horror story for the most part, but what it does is it takes its time. The Blob is a much slower burn than many other horror films, even when you compare it to the newer versions of The Blob, such as Son of the Blob and the 1988 remake. It has a much slower, more deliberate, slower burn than they do. And that's not a bad thing, because often older movies, such as from the 50s or earlier, will be more dialogue based. And some of my favourite movies come from that kind of era or even earlier, stuff like Hitchcock's Rope, among a variety of other Hitchcock movies, Psycho, 12 Angry Men even, which isn't a horror movie but it's just a great film, and it's one of my favourites. I love good dialogue, character-based movies, because if you get great characters, you can literally just have them talking to each other for 2 hours and it will still be interesting. Not necessarily to everyone, but it has the potential to be interesting. That's one of the reasons why my favourite Tarantino movie is The Hateful Eight, because that movie is like a 70 or 80-year-old film, but it works today, because it combines that character-based, conversational style with Tarantino's over-stylized gore, great sound, great music, all that kind of good stuff. And to me, The Blob is one of those movies which is easy to underestimate and just stamp as a B-movie and say, yeah, it was cute for its time, now the effects don't really hold up. It's a relic, really, of the horror world. It's not. It's a movie which still holds up really well. It's got oodles of charm to it, which goes far further than special effects will. That's why some of my favourite films have not just great effects, but a great overall package of the characters, the sound, the visuals, and they have that special spark. Because there are so many rip-offs of movies like Alien or The Thing, but none of them are ever as good. And that's not necessarily an automatic thing. You can make a movie which is better than the movie which is copying. It's not guaranteed though, it can be done. But so often they fail at that because they miss what made the original so good, that special spark. And The Blob has that spark. It's just got this charm to it which, even though it doesn't have gore in a conventional sense, although for the time it was pretty intense, or deaths all over the place, although there are enough deaths to get you by, especially for the 50s, it's, as I said earlier, easy to underestimate. You have to put yourself in that 50s mindset and really sink yourself into the vintage style of a film like this. And when you do so, if you have that kind of appreciation for really old school horror, then you can thoroughly enjoy The Thing. Now, as far as how it holds up, I would say that in some ways, modern audiences might find it a little too slow, because a lot of horror movies have a faster pace, especially newer ones. That will be an issue for some people. For me personally, it's not, although even for me, I will say it is not in my top 10 go-to as far as rewatchability. And the fact that the pace is a little bit slower does contribute to that. And that is why I would give the edge in that regard to the 1988 film, because you do get more intense gore, more showy practical effects, that kind of stuff. However, in its own way, this is, I would say, an essential addition to a really good creature feature or monster-based horror collection. Now, as far as our individual breakdowns, before we get to Son of the Blob, first of all, of course, we have the story and the plot. And for the story and plot of the original 50s The Thing, I'm going to give it a 5. Now that doesn't sound like a great score, a 5 out of 10, but as I've mentioned before, 5 is my entry level score. That's what every movie should be at the very least. And that's basically what I'm saying about The Blob. The story won't blow your mind. It is very much so the stereotypical B-movie idea. Not a stereotypical story, or a stereotypical way of carrying out the story, but the concept of an alien landing on Earth and then eating people isn't an original one. It's been done before, and it's been done since. So, giving it a 5 is basically my way of saying, it won't blow your mind, but it's more than good enough. As far as the characters, the casting, the way that the characters are presented, the choices that they make, how likeable they are, or how hateable they are when necessary, I'm going to give it a 7, which is a pretty decent score for an older film, because very often back then, characters would overact, or the actors more specifically would overact their characters. They'd be very big and very loud and very bombastic. And in this movie, although some are, for the most part, they're actually quite measured and quite held back in terms of how over the top the characters are. They're quite likeable. A number of the characters remain through most, if not all, of the story, which makes it very easy to follow along and hope that they do well. Characters who are dislikable, for sure. Some which are annoying, perhaps, but not too bad. Certainly not as annoying as most modern horror films that I've seen. And overall, I like it. I like the casting, and also I loved seeing McQueen in one of his earliest roles. This may have even been his first role, if I remember correctly, and it's fun to see him not in the confident role that he's usually seen in. He usually, in most of his films, has kind of that cool guy persona. He enters the room, he knows what he's doing, he knows what he's there for, and he owns the situation. In this movie, he doesn't. He's a young guy, he doesn't really understand what's going on. He's basically just out on a date, and he bumps into friends and goes around a small, sleepy town. And he's not a hero. He's just a guy who happens to be in a situation, and he portrays that pretty well. So overall, I like the characters. I like the choices that were made for them and the way the actors carried it out. As far as the visuals go, well, again, I'm going to be pretty generous to a very old movie and give it another 7. And the main reasons for that 7 is because, one, the effects of the blob itself are really good. The blob might not look intimidating, but the way it moves in the film is extremely well done. The practical effects, because of course they didn't have CGI back then, and they're all the better for it as far as I'm concerned, are really well done. The way the creature moves, the way it acts, the way it seems to have this personality, even though it doesn't have a face or make any intelligible noise, it's an intimidating concept. And as I mentioned very early on in this video, I wanted to touch on just how effective a horror concept the blob is, and this is something which is portrayed even better, to be honest, in the 1988 film, which we'll get to next week. But even as far back as in this movie, this is the kind of horror monster where you have to think about it to appreciate just how terrifying the blob is, because when you see a lump of red jelly coming towards you, that's not really scary. But when you think about what is involved in the blob killing you, this isn't some Freddy who's going to make a joke and slice you open. It's not a Jason who's going to cut your head off. It's not the Thing who's going to make you become one of it. This is a creature which simultaneously asphyxiates you and deconstitutes you. It dissolves you. It doesn't melt you because there's no heat involved. It uses acid to deconstitute your skin, then your muscle, then all of your internal organs and tissues, to literally eat you alive. But at the same time, you can't scream because you're inside a liquid, and you can't breathe because in effect you're like suspended in water, but water that you can't move in. It's actually one of the most terrifying ways of dying if you really think about it. Now, of course, in the 50s film you don't see that on screen, but it's there to think about if you want to, such as in one of my favourite movies, and I would say one of the scariest movies of all time if you think about it, the original Andromeda Strain. Terrifying movie in concept, not necessarily in the way it's carried out. A thinking person's horror character. And to me that's what the blob is. Is the movie scary? No, of course not. It's campy, it's fun, it's colourful, at least the version I saw was, with the updated visuals, and it's a whole lot of fun. But it's a very effective horror creature the more you think about it, and it's very easy to see why it would have given kids nightmares, for instance, or even unsettled some teens perhaps way back in the day. As far as the audio goes, the soundtrack, well, actually I'm going to give it another 7 because the music in the film is pretty good. The music back then in these older films, be it horror films or whatever, was very over the top usually, and that's the case here in a good way. But also I love the fact that the blob has its own theme tune, and I've got that theme tune on my phone just as one of the songs that I listen to because I love it. It's so cheesy and campy and very 50s B-movie, but it suits it so well. It kind of underplays the horror because, of course, back then they didn't want to terrify people as much as they do now. They wouldn't go that far with what they would show and present, but it's got a nice fun to it, the soundtrack overall. Plus, again, in the version that I saw, the sound itself was updated pretty nicely, and when we talk about Son of the Blob in a second, it is strange how a movie's quality, or a sequel's quality, can drop so much even 20 years later with newer technology. But that's for us to talk about in a minute. Finally though, we have the rewatchability and the entertainment factor, and for that I'm going to keep the streak alive with another 7. Because for me, this is definitely a highly rewatchable movie. It's one of my favourite classic films in a general sense, not just for horror, because it's entertaining, it's fun, it's light-hearted in a horror kind of way. It's one of the most light-hearted horror movies you could possibly watch, actually, and yet for its time, it was really effective and really iconic. Not necessarily crazy successful, but certainly an icon and one which has endured to this day, so much so that I believe people are still in talks now about remaking The Blob again, which I'm all for that, but they're going to use CGI. That's just something which we have to accept at this point, and for The Blob, I hate that, because that is not what The Blob is about. The Blob is about as practical effects driven as you can possibly get, so it really would be a shame to do that. Even the awful sequel was still practical, the 1988 movie was still practical, so it would be a real shame to have the fourth one in the franchise be CGI, but it's inevitable, so we'll see how they do. Of course I'll see it in cinemas if I get the chance, but that's for a future time. Now, that means that our overall score for the 1950s Blob, as a tabulation of all 5 put together, is a pretty respectable 3.3 out of 5. Not a crazy high score, but I think that does mirror the respect that I have for the film and the enjoyment which I have from it also. It's very rewatchable, both with a group of friends and on your own. With a group of friends it's pretty good as well, because you can laugh at the campy factors but also have fun with the effects, and because there's so much "now look here, see" kind of classic dialogue, you can talk over the film and not really miss that much, because it is a very visual story. Bright colours, small sleepy town scenery, a bright blue car most of the time, and of course the creature. So of course, if you haven't seen the original Blob and you are a horror fan, don't go into it expecting to be scared, like, at all. Even if you were like 6 years old, this wouldn't scare you, I don't think. But I think you can enjoy it. It's certainly got a lot to love. But now moving on from that into a very small mini review for the sequel to this in the 1970s, Son of the Blob, also known sometimes as Beware the Blob. I went into this movie not really knowing what to expect. I love the original. I watched the 1988 one after that and loved that one. This one though, I didn't know, because the 88 and the original have basically the same story, so you know what to expect. With this one, it's a different story, and although I can't get into it too in depth, because to do so would spoil the ending of the first film, I will say that somebody comes across the Blob and it escalates from there. It's about as basic a description of the plot as I can give, but as I said, I can't really get super into it for the sake of the first film, and I'm much more concerned with spoiling the first film, or not doing so, than I am spoiling this piece of absolute garbage, because this is easily one of the worst movies I have ever seen. And it pains me to say that, because I'm such a big fan of The Blob. I love the original, I love the 88 film, I love the character as a concept. I think it's one of the few horror characters that could genuinely go up against John Carpenter's The Thing, which is my favourite movie of all time, and potentially have a good fight against that monster. Because The Thing is a formidable opponent, and The Blob could potentially go up against it. As could Splinter from 2008's Splinter, but that's of course a review which we've already done, and a discussion for another time. However, this movie is, as I said, one of the worst films I've ever seen, and as I alluded to in my review just now for the original movie, I don't understand how the quality of a movie can drop so much despite being however many years newer, the best part of 20 years newer. How can it get so bad in that time? The sound is muffled, the music is extremely loud, very funky disco, which is way over the top, so much so that you just can't hear people talking some of the time. The colours are washed out and sometimes overdone, it's very inconsistent, the camera work is far too close up on people's faces a lot of the time, plus it's just really grainy and looks like it was filmed on a potato. It's awful in pretty much every way. As far as the story itself, a lot of parts feel totally unnecessary, and the weird thing about this movie is that it's told and the story is written and it's directed in such a way that it tries to capture the character and the campy fun of the original, but it totally misses the mark, because instead of becoming camp and charming, it becomes slapstick and stupid. There are so many scenes in this movie which are just ridiculous. rather than the fun of the first film. The first film has some silly stuff, but it knows that. This movie, it takes itself so seriously, but in a really stupid kind of way. It's like it's dumb, but it's sincerely dumb, which makes it even worse. And this is one of the few films that I've watched where I actually felt like I dropped some IQ points after having watched it. It's that bad. Now, I know some people will still love it, because that's what some people do. They love to love bad films. For me, though, I cannot stand this movie. I watched it once, I fast-forwarded it a lot of the time. I watched most of the movie on 1.5 times speed, and even then it wasn't going fast enough, because this is a horrendous film. Now, I am going to give it scores just for the sake of it, to give you some idea of how I feel about this movie, and spoiler alert, it's the worst movie I've ever reviewed on the channel, because first of all, I'm going to give the story and plot a 2, and that's being generous, because it's way under par, but at the same time, the story is not unwatchable. The movie is, and there is a big difference. It might sound like I'm saying the same thing, but the movie and the way the movie is carried out is totally different to the story and the potential of the story. The story is passable. It's not good, it's not even close, but it's passable. It's certainly as good as some horrendous modern horror films, but that doesn't make it worthy of a high score. At the same time, a score of 1 would indicate that it could not get any worse, and the simple fact is, the story could get even worse, so I am going to give it a 2. As far as the characters though, I'm going straight down to the bottom of the barrel with a 1. They're horrendous, awful casting, nobody recognisable in particular of any importance, at least in lead roles, and what's more to say? They're just awful characters doing stupid things and getting killed by the blob. They deserve to die, most of them. You don't care when they die, and some of them are just straight up annoying characters that show up over and over and over again for no apparent reason. So, moving on now to the visuals and effects, it's a 1. And I hate to give it a 1 because I love the fact that it's still a practical creature, and I love, with a small spoiler, but who really cares at this point, within the first, say, 10 minutes, you don't see it, but you kind of see the blob eat a kitten, which is a cool concept. I know cat lovers won't like that, but they kind of went there. That's kind of taboo to do stuff like that, especially back then, but they did it. That was kind of redeeming for a few seconds, but then I fell back into the tar pit that is this movie, and it's horrendous overall. The visuals are horrendous. Any kind of good effects and practical effects that are used, they're just negated by the fact that it's such a bad looking film. It's like watching a movie through a dirty window. It's awful. As far as the soundtrack, the audio, it's another 1, because I don't think it could get any worse. Having no music at all would have been a better idea, because as I said earlier, it's too loud, it's too crazy, it's too over the top, you can't hear people talking. Yeah, it's stupid. If I remember correctly, I think there's a whole party scene in the movie where the music's way too loud again. It's dumb. It's dumb. I'm giving it a 1. And finally, for the rewatchability, I want to give it a 0, but I don't think I'm ever going to give a movie a 0, because that's just not how my score system works. But I'm giving it a 1, because I'm never going to watch it again. I don't care if somebody wants to watch it with me, I'm not going to watch it again. It's a horrendous film. I barely got through it just for the sake of taking notes to do this review. So overall, I'm giving Son of the Blob, or Beware the Blob, a very generous score of 0.6 out of 5, which is way more than this movie deserves. So the original gets a 3.3, which is very respectable. This one gets a 0.6. So one of the worst sequels I've ever seen, one of the worst movies I've ever seen. If you stuck around for the review, thanks very much for that. Never watch this movie. So overall, check out the first one for sure. It's a horror classic, the definition of a B-movie classic, and one of the best B-movies ever made, in fact. The second one, total misfire, waste of time. Save yourself a couple bucks or whatever it is to rent it or buy it, and just give it a miss. So, of course, be sure to stick around for the next review next week, where we're going to discuss the 1988 remake. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.